At one time or another, many of us have dreamed of finding buried treasure, like something out of an adventure film. While most are never lucky enough, some find treasure hiding right in their own backyard. Matthew Emanuel, a Staten Island resident, is one of the lucky few. However, his treasure wasn't buried. Instead, a rusted, locked safe hid in plain sight in Emanuel's backyard. Emanuel assumed that the rusted box was merely a random electrical cabinet. For years, he left it alone, never touching it. But when the family started doing some renovations, Emanuel needed to take a closer look at what he thought was just a rusted box. When he opened it, Emanuel's heart stopped. What he discovered triggered a chain of events that would have far-reaching results. For a little over 4 years, Matthew Emanuel lived with his beautiful family, wife Maria and son Alex, in the exclusive Greenbelt neighborhood of Todd Hill, Staten Island. At the time, Emanuel worked as a financial advisor, and the family lived in a beautiful home. They all enjoyed an incredible, peaceful life in suburbia. Over the years, the family decorated and explored almost every inch of their large home. However, throughout that time, one small corner of their backyard remained untouched. Emanuel never realized that a part of the family's garden hid a massive secret. Soon, this secret would change his family's life forever. While the family enjoyed their house for nearly half a decade, they never imagined something hidden in their garden that could make a remarkable difference in their lives. Not only that, but the secret that hid in their backyard contained a treasure, like something right out of a pirate movie. Surprisingly, the treasure hadn't even been buried. It lied tucked away in the shadows in the corner of Emanuel's family backyard, waiting for someone to stumble across it. However, the hidden object contained a lot more than treasure. It also held the answer to a years-old mystery in their neighborhood. In the Emanuel family's backyard, nestled in the ground by the side of their fence, a great mystery lied waiting for someone to find it. It was a random box, one that no one in the family had seen before. Also, it had clearly not been moved or touched in a long time, as it was beaten up and covered in dust and dirt. Furthermore, tons of poison ivy had grown all over it, so no one in the family even went near the box, wanting to avoid the ivy's stinging burn. At one point, gardeners had even dropped buckets of mulch on the box without taking a second glance. However, a random event would bring the mysterious object to the Emanuel's attention. In the winter of 2018, New York State experienced some particularly harsh storms. During one storm, the heavy snow caused trees lining the Emanuel family's yard to topple over. The trees not only knocked over some fencing, but also brought the rusted box back out into the open. Matthew Emanuel first noticed the box the morning after the storm, as some deer munched on the vegetation covering it. After the deer left, he got a better view of the large, rusty object, partially submerged in the ground. However, Emanuel didn't feel the need to investigate it further. "I just thought it was some kind of electric box," he later recalled. So, he went on continuing to ignore it. Time went on, and the Emanuel family continued to ignore the rusted box. After all, they'd much bigger things to worry about. Most noticeably, winter storms had caused some severe damage to their backyard. Now, as spring came along and the storms died down, they'd no longer leave their garden in that state. It seems crazy to think that the Emanuels had a valuable mystery hiding right under their nose. If the Emanuels had any idea what the mysterious rusted object contained, they likely would never have let it sit there for so long. But sometimes, the most incredible things hide in plain sight. Soon, Matthew Emanuel would discover why someone hid the box so well. For years, the box hid right under the Emanuels' noses, completely visible, albeit tucked away from their family room window. Later, they realized they could also see it from the front deck as it hid in a corner. In fact, you can even spot the box in some of their family photos from the years before they found it. Now, the Emanuels had finally discovered the hidden box. Still, even though the beginnings of the garden renovations, they ignored the strange box. "It was just a rusty box," Matthew Emanuel said, behind some trees. However, while Emanuel didn't think much about it, someone else would. As a result of the extensive damages that winter caused, Matthew Emanuel had to completely redesign his family's back garden. Still thinking the box was electrical, Emanuel realized he'd need to work around the box during his renovation. As the work grew and the difficulty increased, He made the decision to call in some outside help. So Matthew Emanuel started looking for an expert landscaper. But first, he needed to discuss with his wife what they wanted. After some time, they decided to go with bamboo as it's stronger during storms. However, Emanuel and his wife had picked a plant that would force them to deal with a rusted box in the corner of their garden. After some time searching for a landscape expert, Emanuel finally found one that suited his needs. Bamboo is not the easiest plant to grow and can often affect neighbors, so they needed someone who knew what they were doing. Soon, Emanuel called the bamboo expert and made an appointment to discuss the details of how he wanted their garden to look after completion. Emanuel decided to hire the expert to do the job, and soon the restorations would begin to take place. However, what Emanuel didn't know was he was about to hire quite the character. Thankfully, this landscape expert would be a little more interested in a family's hidden rusted box than Emanuel was. Emanuel found a horticulturist who specializes in exotic plants to help him plant bamboo on the side for more privacy. The landscaper, Robert Foley, goes by the nickname Bamboo Bob. In fact, he insists that even interviewers call him Bamboo Bob instead of Mr. Foley or Robert. Despite his oddities, Emanuel hired Bamboo Bob, who then made the trip to Staten Island in late April 2018. As an experienced landscaper, Bamboo Bob has come across plenty of bizarre landscape features. However, on April 28th, when he arrived at the Emanuel's property, Bamboo Bob admitted he'd never seen anything like the Emanuel's odd rusted box. What exactly was he looking at? As Bamboo paced around the Emanuel's back garden, Bamboo Bob noticed the mystery rusted box, about 2 feet wide and 1.5 feet deep, buried in a few inches of dirt. Immediately, he needed to know more. "You never know what's under the ground," Foley said. "Every job, I've got to know what's going on." So Bamboo Bob asked Emanuel what he knew about the box. He said, "I don't know," Foley remembers. I said, "How long have you lived here?" The box looked like it had been there for a lot longer than 4 years. Bamboo Bob couldn't resist the temptation of figuring out what the box held. Furthermore, he had some suspicions that the Emanuels had no idea that they had. Bamboo Bob has been turning over soil for decades as a landscaper hired for gardens, zoos, and backyards all over New York and New Jersey. Despite all the bizarre sights that he had witnessed throughout his years of work, he'd never seen something even close to what was laying in the Emanuel's backyard. However, he knew one thing for sure. It was no electrical box. Bamboo Bob also could tell he had one of the most interesting finds of his career. As he waited for his crew to arrive with the proper tools, Bob continued to look at the box. The first thing he noticed was that no cables came out of it. Furthermore, not only did it stick halfway out of the dirt, but it also seemed poorly buried. Whoever had tried to bury this box had not been a professional. What could it be? Bamboo Bob had been in enough backyards to witness many bizarre situations. That's why he couldn't resist digging up the box and finding out what its true purpose was. So, as soon as his crew arrived, Bob got to work uncovering the box. They needed to be careful on the off chance that it did connect to the electrical grid. After an hour or so, Bob and the workers uncovered the rusted box. Once free, the workers turned it over, revealing a dial. It turned out it was a safe, a locked one made out of thick metal, rusted from the years outside. Now, after so many years hibernating just 20 feet from the Emanuel's door, someone had discovered it. Bamboo Bob and his workers showed the rusted safe to Emanuel. The homeowner couldn't believe the find. It seemed like something out of an adventure film. "I'd seen it the whole time," Emanuel said. "I've been throwing mulch on it since moving into the house." Emanuel had always assumed the box was merely an electric cabinet attached to his fence. He never once thought it could be anything else, let alone something valuable. However, he couldn't have been more wrong. The safe that lay in his yard would become the greatest find he or Bamboo Bob and his workers ever discovered. However, now they had a brand new mystery to solve. What hid inside the locked safe? And perhaps more importantly, who did it belong to? The safe was roughly 2 feet wide and 1.5 feet high. Also, it was heavy, weighing somewhere between 80 and 100 pounds by the workers' guesses. Regardless of its weight and height, Emanuel had to find out the contents of the rusted box he ignored all those years. Emanuel rocked it back and forth, wondering if maybe he could hear the jingling of coins inside, but no luck. Still, that didn't necessarily mean that the safe was empty. and Emmanuel felt no desire to stop there. All he needed was a little more time to figure out a way he could break it open. Emmanuel instructed the workers to move the safe to the deck of the house so they could further investigate. The rusted box remained there for days as the landscapers worked on the back garden. Meanwhile, Emmanuel focused himself on an entirely different assignment. At first, Emmanuel tried to learn how to open safes and looked into getting a locksmith. However, eventually, he and Bamboo Bob grew tired of waiting and decided to open it. Once they finally pried it open, using some construction equipment no less, the contents stunned Emmanuel to his core. He couldn't believe that such a treasure had hidden in his backyard for years. Once they were able to break it open, Emmanuel and the landscapers could scarcely believe their eyes. The first thing we saw was stacks of hundreds, about 3 inches thick and stuck together, Bamboo Bob said. The safe contained small zipped plastic bags of gold, diamond rings, earrings, and other jewelry. "It's like a childhood dream that you find treasure," said Emmanuel. Emmanuel couldn't believe his luck. He and the landscapers had just stumbled across a real-life treasure right in the middle of the fallen trees of his Staten Island home. Nevertheless, Emmanuel immediately noticed something was wrong with his treasure haul. Unfortunately, by the time Matthew Emmanuel discovered the safe in his backyard, it was too late. As it turns out, the safe was not waterproof. After years of sitting in the backyard of his Staten Island home, many of the bills contained in the safe had almost disintegrated. Not only that, but some of the large wads of bills had stuck together after many seasons of soaking and drying. If Emmanuel even tried to lift one bill off the stack, they might all rip. However, Emmanuel admits that at the moment, he didn't care much. After all, the safe contained much more than just the bills. Plus, Emmanuel didn't want to touch any of it until he could figure out what to do with it. Over the next few days, Emmanuel peeled apart some of the wet dollar bills and set them aside to dry. The project took longer than he expected, but he went above and beyond, doing whatever he could to keep the treasure safe. As he began working, Emmanuel started to believe he could save some of the bills. Still, Emmanuel knew that it would take hard work to see how many dollar bills there were. He continued working tirelessly, only to find out it wouldn't be as easy as he thought it would. For every step forward he took, it felt like 2 steps back. It started to seem too hard to salvage most of the bills, let alone all of them. As he continued to work, Matthew Emmanuel realized he could only manage to salvage a small part of the cash. Unfortunately, the weather had simply done too much damage to the majority of the tender. Still, Emmanuel managed to save a small portion of the bills, which put him considerably in the black. Furthermore, the bills only made up a small portion of the safe's contents, and Emmanuel didn't know how much some of the jewelry would go for. However, he was about to find out more information about the mystery box's origins that would once again change the course of events. Matthew Emmanuel knew he needed to determine the worth of the rest of his newly discovered treasure. However, another question burned in the back of his mind, one he didn't think he wanted to know the answer to: how much money had he lost? Nevertheless, Emmanuel set out to answer his question. Unfortunately, by Emmanuel's calculations, he lost roughly 50 worth of 100 bills due to exposure and damage. Still, he knew he had managed to save at least a dozen or so bills over his long process. So, having figured out how much he lost, Emmanuel started to count how many bills he'd saved. As it turns out, Emmanuel had lost count and preserved quite a few more Benjamins than he thought. After figuring out how much he'd lost, Emmanuel started counting his slightly faded, newly dried bills. After calculating his gains the first time, he needed to count again. Emmanuel couldn't believe it. He'd saved over 16. Finally, Emmanuel knew how much he'd earned from the safe in cash, and it was a lot more than he'd ever dreamed of earning from a rusty old box. Furthermore, this only accounted for the cash in the safe. He still needed to count the jewelry and the gold. However, soon Emmanuel began to think this might be too good to be true. Perhaps this safe still belonged to someone. The more Matthew Emmanuel thought about the safe, the less it made sense. Who'd hide a safe in the backyard and then just forget about it? While finding treasure made his life seem like an adventure flick, Emmanuel couldn't help but wonder if someone needed the safe back. Many people would have merely pocketed the riches from the safe and lived happily ever after. However, Emmanuel didn't want to do the wrong thing or upset the wrong people. So, he decided that while he counted up the rest of the safe's contents, he'd look for clues to reveal the owner. And, Emmanuel found precisely who he was looking for. After he finished counting all the cash, Emmanuel proceeded to his next task. He wanted to do an inventory of all the riches and jewelry that were also inside the safe box alongside those dollars. Meanwhile, Emmanuel kept an eye out for even the tiniest hint at safe owner's identity. The number of goods and gold he found inside the box surprised him, to say the very least. The gold kept stacking up, to the point where Emmanuel needed to use other tools just to keep track of everything. It was mind-boggling, he said. There was so much gold. I was using my kitchen scale. It probably weighed a pound or more. While he measured and cataloged the goods, Emmanuel came across a piece of paper in a plastic bag that changed everything. Emmanuel put all the jewelry aside and focused his attention on the piece of paper. He opened the plastic bag and unfurled it. And to his surprise, there was an address on it. He immediately knew he had to look it up online and figure out where it led. That's not to say that Emmanuel didn't have second thoughts, as we all likely would. He understood that if the address led him to the original owner, he'd probably need to return his newly discovered treasure. However, Emmanuel could never live with himself knowing the safe's owner still lived somewhere out there, so he went to his computer to try and hunt down the owner of the safe. For a moment, Emmanuel wondered if the address would lead him to a criminal instead of someone who'd simply lost it. However, what criminal would leave their home address with their stash? The most likely outcome would be that he'd find the people who'd lost a safe during a move or had lived in his house previously. In the end, Emmanuel followed his instincts and typed the address into Google Maps. When the results came back, Emmanuel felt the same way he had when he opened the safe. Absolutely stunned, he even double-checked the information just to be sure. As it turns out, Emmanuel was just steps away, literally, from finally solving the mystery of his backyard safe. As it turned out, to Emmanuel's surprise, the address he found on the piece of paper stashed deep inside the box wasn't too far away. Surprisingly, he didn't even need a car to get there. He could walk. Although this likely meant no treasure for Emmanuel, he felt great that he could return the safe to its rightful owners. After a little more research, Emmanuel discovered the address sat right in his neighborhood. In fact, he regularly strolled by the house while walking his dog. Once he realized that safe's owners sat less than a 10-minute walk from his own home, Emmanuel knew what he needed to do. He found himself on a new mission. With this new information, Matthew Emmanuel figured he couldn't just keep the news of the treasure to himself. It just wouldn't be right to know someone might have lost the safe and wondered where it went. After all, it might represent someone's savings or inheritance. Just a few days after discovering real-life buried treasure in his backyard, he decided to pay a visit to the address that he'd found inside the mysterious rusted box. Though he wasn't positive if they were, in fact, the people who the safe box belonged to, something inside him told he needed to check. Emmanuel was determined to find out where the box came from. Emmanuel had no way of knowing who had answered the door. Though he'd walked by the house before, he'd never seen anyone out front. Furthermore, Emmanuel had no idea how to start the conversation or what to ask. However, he decided to move forward with his plan and approach the address he found inside the rusted box. Worst case scenario, if he couldn't find the owners, he'd have to involve the police. Despite all the risks that came along with his visit, he decided to knock on the door. Hopefully someone would answer that could help solve the mystery of the rusted safe. On April 30th, 2018, Emmanuel knocked on the door of the address he found. He had no idea what to expect, knocking on a stranger's door and asking about a crime that might not have occurred. To him, it seemed like quite the risk. However, as they say, nothing ventured, nothing gained. An elderly woman answered the door, and Emmanuel introduced himself before cutting right to the chase. "I have a strange question for you," he said. "Have you ever been robbed?" If the answer was a harsh no, everything would have ended right there. But as Emmanuel watched the elderly woman's reaction, he realized he made the right decision. The woman started to shake, which could only mean one of two things. She was either terribly upset or extremely excited. Emmanuel had hardly prepared for the woman's reaction. The question that Emmanuel asked the elderly woman left her surprised. Still shaking, the woman confirmed Emmanuel's suspicions. Someone had robbed her. Then the painful memories resurfaced as the elderly woman attempted to explain what had happened. While Emmanuel felt touched because of the woman's reaction, he felt relieved to have found the true origins of the mystery box on his backyard. He'd finally found the answers he was looking for. In the end, everything turned out for the best. However, there was still one last mystery that Emmanuel wanted to solve. Could he possibly provide the missing link? The night after the 2011 Christmas, a burglar broke into her home. They had no idea what was going on inside their household. By the time she and her husband realized what happened, the thief was too far away for them to even try and catch him. The criminal left her home with $52,000 worth of jewelry and cash. Unfortunately, all the savings of the couple had vanished in a heartbeat. The couple never imagined that a stranger would be knocking at their door 6 years after the crime, asking them this bizarre question. But how could this happen in such an exclusive neighborhood? While Tadirli is one of the most exclusive communities in Staten Island, not too long ago, its population was suffering at the hands of an unknown thief. At the time of the robbery in 2011, Staten Island was facing a wave of crime. No one knew who the unseen menace was, but they called him the Ninja Burglar because of how stealthy he had been. Even worse, the criminal was surprisingly successful. From 2005 to 2015, the Ninja Burglar robbed over 200 homes in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Just in Staten Island, he stole from 160 homes. Could this also be one of his works? A man called Robert Costanza was finally arrested in Staten Island back in 2016. He had a criminal past and was in court for something unrelated when he confessed, and they charged him for robbery. He admitted to the investigators that he was responsible for over 100 burglaries, in which he stole $4 million worth in property, and they sentenced him to 22 years in jail. The residents of Todd Hill could breathe easily again. However, by the time the burglar was convicted, the woman Emmanuel had met had already lost hope. The police told her she'd never see her belongings again, but they couldn't have been more wrong. Now that he'd finally solved the backyard mystery, Emmanuel told the woman that he might have her belongings. "Well, I think I have your stuff," Emmanuel said. He continued, "Why don't you come over to my house and I'll show it to you?" Then, Emmanuel and the woman walked around the corner to his house to see if she could identify some of the objects they found inside the safe box. Emmanuel was excited to show the woman what he'd found. The rusted box had been sitting there for 4